without further ado, let's go ahead and get going. Now, when we're talking about bone, one of the big components we need to understand first is what's known as stiffness. So this is going to be how much stress, strain we can really get into a loaded material. And effectively, that stress is going to be divided by the amount of change that happens in the shape. So something is stiffer if obviously you apply more stress to it before it starts to change its shape. So compressive strength is the strength that an object has of effectively being pushed together. Okay, that's going to be compressive strength. Okay, now what's going to go ahead and be the major components that are going to contribute to both compressive strength and stiffness is going to be the effective amount of calcium that we have inside of that structure. So calcium carbonate, so calcium ion bonded to a carbonate ion, which is going to be carbon and some oxygen, and then calcium phosphate, which is going to be calcium bound to phosphate and then also some oxygen. Now, bone can deal with the greatest amount of compression forces, okay? It can deal with a decent amount of tension forces, and that's going to be pulling things apart. Shearing is where we're twisting from one side to the other, or we're trying to slot one side past the other. That's the type of force that bone can deal with the least of. And if you guys want to see some, we'll call them, for that, Anna. You want to see some disturbing videos online, Google arm wrestling arm breaks, and you'll actually see the spiral fracture of the humerus that can occur when you happen to be going through that great of internal rotation torques. They're pretty gnarly, okay? Now, when we think about putting more of a bending force on the bone, one side of it is going to be undergoing compression while the other side is going to be undergoing tension as it happens to be being pulled apart. Anytime we're creating torque through rotating, not at the joints, guys, but rotating through the bone, so throwing a baseball, internal, external rotation, that's going to be creating those shear forces as well. So what's going to give us more of that flexibility and tensile force is collagen, okay? Collagen is a protein that we're going to be making and turning over all the time. Collagen is what's giving your skin its certain amount of elasticity and essentially holding its position. And then collagen is pretty much what your tendons and ligaments are made up of. Now, a decent amount of your bone happens to be water, and then bones are naturally porous. So inside of the bone, there happens to be a lot of empty space. In fact, that's where we're going to find our wonderful bone marrow, which is going to be what's producing our red blood cells and our white blood cells. So at effectively the center of the bone, that's where we're going to find what's known as cortical bone. So if we're thinking about, that's going to be the picture of a tibia. We're going to have this cortical bone going through the center. Now, trabecular bone, okay, which is going to see a greater amount of porosity down here. So it doesn't have as much thickness on the sides like it does with cortical bone. This is going to be at the ends of our bone, and also the same type of situation we're going to find with our vertebrae. So now this porosity is going to effectively allow for that bone to have a little bit more tolerance of strain, because it has that ability to effectively move a bit before it breaks. Cortical bone, because it happens to have so little porosity, if you try to make it bend, it's going to go ahead and break. So that's why the types of breaks you get in kind of the middle of your bone, as opposed to at the ends, are going to have differing effects on kind of how long it takes to recover, and then also how much force is going to be required. And then that's also where you can get a lot worse shattering effects if it happens to be more in the midpoint along the length of the bone. Now, we then have the first major way that we kind of separate our skeleton. We have our axial, which is going to be effectively just that perfect straight line down the center. So we've got our head, our entire vertebral column, our rib cage. Now, everything appendicular is outside of that. So that's where we've got from our scapula and clavicle down our arms, we've got our hips, and then everything that goes down to the bottom of our feet. So from there, we are going to have 4 different classifications. We've got short bones, which is going to be like our carpals and our tarsals. Our flat bones, which are going to obviously have flatter components to them. So our sternum, our scapula, our ribs are going to be example of it, and our patella, and even a little bit some of the bones of our skull. We then have irregular bones. So these are going to be things that just look weird. So see how we've got a vertebral, sacrum, coccyx, and our maxilla. Now, then finally, we have our long bones. So this is going to be our humerus, our radius, our ulna, femur, tibia, and fibula. Now, how our bones are actually going to grow in length is thanks to changes at what are known as our epiphyses. Now, or epithelial plates. Now, this is going to be where, notice at the end, where we're going to have new bone cells that are going to be being produced, and where we're going to keep increasing the length. And we can see this cortical bone we'll have a lot of what's known as osteoblasts, which are going to be adding to our bone mineralization. So it's going to increase length. Now, once we happen to be mature adults, that's where we're going to have these plates fuse closed. And congratulations, that's as tall as you are going to get. Oh, sorry. Now, inside of the bone, we have what's known as the prosteum, okay? This is where we're going to have a membrane covering the bone, where we're going to be building concentric layers of new bone on top of the existing ones. This is being done by those cells I alluded to just briefly ago, which are known as osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are the ones that build new bone tissue. Osteoclasts are the ones that resorb bone tissue. Now, the reason why we have this building and then also removing is A, it gives us the ability to improve the strength of our bones where we need it. But B, it makes it so the body only has as much bone mass as it needs to have. It's not going to carry around extra if it can help it. The other component to keep in mind is not only is it going to make sure that we have the bone mass that we need where we need it, is the simple reality that we use a lot of calcium every day. Calcium is very important in muscular contraction, specifically not just in your muscles when you think about moving your body, but also in your heart contractions. And we do sweat out and pee out a little bit of calcium every day. So if you're not getting enough calcium in your diet, your body is naturally going to use that calcium from your bones to make sure your heart still beats. Because otherwise, well, you're taking the long nap and who cares how strong your bones are, because you're not going to keep going. We get more into this whenever we get into muscular contraction, otherwise in exercise physiology. But remember, osteoblasts build bone. Osteoclasts take bone mineralization away. So your bones are essentially going to grow in density and diameter throughout your entire life. Now, they tend to stop growing in length when you happen to be, between 15, really on like the high end and very rare examples, like around 25. And then with women, it tends to be on the lower end. Most guys, it's going to be usually around 20, could be, like I said a bit earlier. For those of you guys that are here, go ahead and throw up in the chat, how old were you effectively when you stopped growing? How old are you when you stopped growing? Nice. So we kind of got a little, and that's okay. Some folks have been completely full grown since they were 12. Some folks weren't fully grown until they happened to be in their early 20s. And yeah, obviously we've got a pretty decent variety. In ways, I bet it was nice to be at your adult height by the time you were only in middle school. Had to give you a couple advantages while playing sports. However, those of you that grew relatively late, it was probably a little frustrating, but welcome to being part of planet Earth. Things aren't always fair. Hey, no judgments. Not on the being lazy. Playing golf I can judge on, but I'm going to try to refrain. Now, bone is what's known as anisotropic. That means it's going to have different strength and stiffness depending on the direction that it happens to being loaded in. So your bones effectively are constantly remodeling. So they're going to deal with not just greater force, but greater force in the directions that you're typically making it receive. So if you are happening to make your body encounter heavy loads in certain angles, certain directions, over time, you're going to get better and better at dealing with those loads in those directions. Now, physical stress is really what's going to go ahead and cause our bodies or bones to essentially hypertrophy to those forces. Now, if we go too far, we're talking about injury, we can literally talk about a closure of a growth plate, and now we can have issues with disparity in limb length, and otherwise it can be a little bit rough. Now, like anything else, we want to make sure that we're not overstressing a young person's skeleton. Does that mean that we shouldn't have young people lift weights?
No.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. Absolutely. The big issue with people when they're essentially growing up is we can have them lift weights, we have them do calisthenics. Look at gymnasts. Your average female gymnast shouldn't be taking supplements. I'm not even talking about using drugs, Gabby. My God. As I clasp my pearls at the idea that we would give drugs to a child. Unless it's antibiotics, vaccines, a myriad of other things that'll actually help, keep them healthy and safe. Maybe supplementation in certain forms of vitamins and minerals if we've got issues with a deficiency. Oh God, yeah, no, you're right. You're right on that one. I will not disagree with you that taking pre-workout, giving little Sally or Sammy some NO explode just sounds really dumb because little kids already have enough energy. We don't need to get even more insane. Instead, think of it along the lines of there's not really a use to maxing out little kids. Who cares what their bench press 1RM is? They haven't even hit puberty. It's not going to give you any great information, but teaching them the movements, teaching them how to squat, how to deadlift, how to clean, how to snatch, how to jerk, it can be great because they've got typically really good mobility when kids are little, and you can make sure they maintain that mobility and have that body control. Now, obviously, you want to make sure that you're being essentially exposed to as many different sports as you can. The research is out there and almost unequivocally says the earlier you specialize a kid, the less they tend to be great at their sport, and the more likely they tend to be to getting injured. So early specialization outside of things like gymnastics, wrestling, figure skating, maybe golf, and a couple other sports is a waste of time. And if anything, it tends to lead to burnouts, and then the kids aren't even interested in playing sports anymore. Congratulations, you're killing it as a parent. Instead, making sure kids are playing a lot of sports and they're just playing. They're just able to run around, do whatever foolish things they want to, as long as it's not going to give them a Darwin Award, is really going to be the key to make sure they have overall appropriate development. Now, one thing that is fascinating for folks that hit like a real hard growth spurt is they can literally get to the point where they're growing so quickly, they're going through literally what some is growing pains. And this is usually because the bones are growing faster than the muscles can handle. So the muscles are going to start to get tight, or tighter and tighter and tighter. So in these situations, you literally want to make sure, that these individuals are stretching all of the time to make sure that we're doing what we can so they can move well. And obviously, when this is happening, we should probably back our training down a little bit. And specifically, if we're doing a lot of strength work and other type of movements, we should probably cut it back and work on proprioception and mobility work during this period of time. In fact, so in the UK, the way that soccer works is it's not like it is in the US, where your parents put a lot of money. Oh, yeah, that sounds about right, Ethan. That can definitely happen. He put in the text that somebody grew 3 inches in a month. What you want to make sure you're doing when we're looking at effectively individuals when they're hitting their peak height velocity, so they're growing at the most rapid rate they're ever going to grow in their life. Well, think about what's changing when it comes to their proprioception. Now, everything is a little bit closer to them than it would have been beforehand, and they're also further from the ground. Their leverages are all changing, so they're going to have to relearn how to operate this body. It'd be the equivalent of if I all of a sudden strapped 6-inch stilts on everybody's feet, and then you had to go play sports. Well, now you've got a much different lever arm through the bottom of your body, which is going to change up the way that you've got pressure on your knees, on your hips, and the way that you're going to move in general. How cutting's going to feel, change of direction. So what professional soccer teams do, specifically, this is Arsenal Soccer, which is a major football club, meaning European soccer club in the UK. What they do is they literally take the heights of their athletes every single month, because they literally have a U8 team, U10, U12, 14, 16, 18, 20, and I think 22 or something along those lines. And as they're going through it, when each of the individual athletes essentially hits that major growth spurt, that's when they're going to change their training, because they find the rates of incidence of injuries just skyrockets. And at this point, they've invested possibly even a decade into this athlete's development. So they don't want to risk anything obviously going wrong. And congratulations, you just broke this kid that you've invested all this time, energy, and resources into effectively getting them to be the best athlete that you can make them. So now the way that our bones are going to respond to stress is what's known as Wolff's Law. Okay. So remember, blasts building, class taking away, bone all the time. So depending on if we have more or less mechanical stress going through our body, we are going to be increasing the activity of one or the other. So if you're just lounging around all day, swimming in the pool, not really having to deal with high forces, well, now we're going to happen to have a greater amount of osteoclast activity and less osteoblast activity. Whereas if you're doing a lot of lifting, plyometrics, running, jumping, sprinting, well, now we've got greater mechanical stress. And so we're going to see a greater amount of osteoblast activity, because the body is constantly remodeling to the demands placed upon it. So it's an important thing to keep in mind when we're working with athletes. We can have some bones that are ready to go, but others that aren't. So for example, if we were to take somebody like a cross-country runner, or not cross-country, we'll say a soccer player, okay? If we were to look at a soccer player and we wanted to convert them over into powerlifting, what bones in their body are probably dense enough and strong enough to deal with the loads in powerlifting? And we're also assuming they've never really lifted weights. Knees are a joint. Yeah. So we're talking about the legs, we're talking about the lower body. Absolutely. Now, what part of their body probably isn't used to a lot of force or otherwise that could make it far more likely to injure? Yeah, the upper body in general, and specifically, I would say more, we're talking the spinal column. And I'm using the example of something like squatting. So you can have athletes that have got legs where they could squat, whatever weight you give them, but they have an upper body that's nowhere near strong enough to deal with the forces that they're going to be encountering in their athletic endeavor. So what's going to go ahead and diminish your bone mineral density? Well, not having to deal with a lot of force. So this can be, we're not exercising, we're spending a lot of time in water because buoyancy affects it, so we don't have to deal with gravitational force, and then bed rest and or getting off this planet. Okay. Now, obviously there's different levels of effort and intensity you need to have in order to have some of these effects. But like anything, if you're not giving your body a reason to keep your bone mass, how are you going to get rid of it? So our good old structure of the bone. Now here, we're going to be obviously looking at our femur. So we've got the articular cartilage, where remember it's going to be in that acetabulum of the hip. Then we have trabecular bone all through the end. We've got our cortical bone going down more of the main shaft. And then notice, guys, we are going to have that vasculature feeding in, because we have bone marrow all the way laced through the long part of the bone. Now, what's fascinating, when people have a hip replacement, so they effectively cut off the femur here, they put a metal spike into the shaft, and then that's where there'll be the new ball and socket to put in. Literally, it takes up the space of where this bone marrow is, and they're actually going to have lower red blood cell production. So a lot of folks that go through, or some folks that go through hip replacements, they can actually find themselves being slightly anemic after the surgery, A, because of blood loss from surgery, but B, also because of the fact that they no longer have all of that space for yellow marrow doing its job inside of the bone. So remember, our bones are going to be effectively doing a form of hypertrophying. Specifically, we're going to be increasing that bone mineral density. In fact, there's research showing that how much bone mass you have is going to be related to how much muscle mass you can have, and that you tend to rarely see situations where people have far greater bone mass than they effectively are going to have, then they're going to have lean mass, because like anything else, your muscles have, or your bones have to be strong enough to deal with all of the forces your muscles can put them through. So typically your athletes that have the greatest muscle mass also have the greatest bone mineral density. So what kinds of activity? Turns out things where we got to bear weight and things where we have larger forces. Okay. So as you'd expect, going from walking to jogging to running to sprinting, we're dealing with greater forces. So sprinting in theory would help the greatest with bone mineral density. Now, if we're going to go ahead and think about lifting weights, what exercises, lifting weights, do you think are going to have the greatest effects on bone mineral density? So think about lower body. What do you think would probably give us the greatest effect?
Squats.
And deadlifts. Great job. Yeah. Yeah. Good point there, Anna and Josh. Squats and deadlifts. Okay. Now, what movements are going to actually have you dealing with potentially even greater forces than squatting or deadlifting? Yes, potentially some of our Olympic lifting. So clean, snatch and deadlift, or sorry, clean, snatch and jerks potentially also can massively increase that bone mineral density. Now, with that being said, if we're thinking about body weight exercises, what type of body weight exercise do you think is probably going to help increase bone mineral density? Absolutely. Plyometrics, because we're dealing with great forces on the takeoff and landing. Now, also think about the loading going through the body when we're doing a movement. You guys are used to standing all day. So doing a bodyweight squat, bodyweight lunge, step up, it's not really challenging your musculature, much less your bone mass, more than what you encounter normally. Now, how many of you guys typically do handstand push-ups? So it's safe to say that all of your body weight going through your hands, wrists, elbows, shoulders, and the bones connecting everything is going to be much higher than what you're used to. So there are certain movements that obviously are going to be much more challenging, which that would be promoting bone mineral density. So that's where, people like, I'm doing yoga for bone mineral density. Like, no, you're not. But if you're doing a lot of things like handstand holds, headstand holds, those quite possibly are increasing bone mineral density, but it's in the upper extremity, which obviously has some uses and some advantages. Whereas obviously how most of us move around is using our legs. And that's where we've got to pick some movements that are going to go ahead and allow us to progress and increase that bone mineral density. Now, are you going to tell Gams to do sets of box jumps when she's trying to get in shape and doesn't want to fracture her hip to start? No, that sounds really dumb. We're starting with walking and then starting with body weight movements. And then we might even have to regress and start off with things like a leg press until we get strong enough to deal with body weight movements. And then once we go beyond that, now we're talking about utilizing different exercises that are going to allow for a full range. So the joints are going to articulate correctly and your muscles are going to overload properly, but then we're also going to be stressing our bone mass appropriately to improve along those angles. Now, what is going to happen if we really aren't able to keep our bone mass up is what's known as osteoporosis. Now, type 1 is going to be effectively what's mostly related to ladies that happen to be over 50. Typically, other confounding factors is they're going to be smaller ladies in the first place by BMI, height, etc., body weight by obviously extension, and not necessarily being sedentary, but never having done a lot of heavy resistance training and other type of exercise to overload the musculature and the bone mass. Now then type 2 is going to be just age associated. So after the age of 70, bones typically are getting a little bit brittler, mostly due, again, guys, to levels of physical activity, how much people are being asked to do, and your body is always adapting to demands you place upon it. No one is going to be massively jacked. Well, it's rarely are you going to meet someone that's just massively jacked and they don't work out at all. They just genetically have it. Most folks have to earn it. Now, don't get me wrong. Some folks didn't have to work as hard for it as others. However, everybody has to at least do some work in order to get to those places. So when we're looking at one person's development compared to another, and we're looking at things like osteoporosis, well, are the people mostly sedentary? They only do very low impact exercise. They don't really overload their body too much. These are all things to keep in mind that are going to be influencing, obviously, how their body's going to respond. So what can we do? Well, the best when it comes to osteoporosis is to avoid it in the first place, then trying to dig yourself out of that hole. Okay. Now, making sure that we're obviously doing some type of physical activity. If ladies are postmenopausal, sometimes hormone replacement will help. Making sure that we're getting in not just enough calcium, but we're getting enough vitamin D, the mineral magnesium, and vitamin K, since all four of those are important for bone mineral density. Calcium and vitamin D being the top two, but then vitamin K and magnesium also being important components, because magnesium helps spare calcium, and vitamin K is also important in the functioning of your ability to increase bone mineralization and actually decalcify your arteries. And yeah, don't be doing a bunch of drugs. Go figure. Smoking, excessive caffeine consumption, and alcohol have all been linked to lower bone mineral density. Not necessarily like it's a perfect 1-to-1, but if you're thinking of this as kind of order of importance, being freaking active and then making sure we're getting enough calcium, magnesium, vitamin D, and vitamin K so we can build that bone thanks to the signal we got initially. And then maybe do hormone replacement therapy, and don't party like a rock star, because it turns out it's really hard on your body. So now this can also happen even in younger individuals. And specifically, this is something that can occur thanks to what's known as the female athlete triad, which is a brutal possible situation with female athletes where the combination of disordered eating, so this can be bulimia, anorexia nervosa, a number of different other eating disorders, amenorrhea, or oligoria. So now either the period comes very rarely or the period doesn't come at all, and then lower bone mineral density. Now, osteopenia is when your bone mineral density is just one standard deviation below the mean of what you'd see for normal people. Osteoporosis is now when you're 2 to 2.5 standard deviations below the mean, meaning if you lined up 100 women, your bones are brittler than 95 of them or more. And so that is not a good situation. So like anything else, we want to make sure when we're working with younger athletes, we're talking appropriately about ideas for body composition, dietary intake, what is an appropriate weight for their sport. Obviously, a lot of D-bags can tell people they just need to be smaller and skinnier. And like anything else, that can lead us down a pretty dark road where you're really risking a lot of negative outcomes. So what can you do? Notice, watch for signs of that eating disorder. Don't get all up about weight. Focus instead on function and health, making sure that people have a good relationship with food. Don't get me wrong. I don't essentially, I wouldn't hope for anyone to really get any type of massive addiction. But one thing I would encourage everyone to do is get a good relationship with food, how they like to eat and how they feel in what way they eat that they feel the best, simply because if any of you guys get an addiction to, well, it's Kentucky, so it's easy to say opiates or meth, or, you know, maybe you got some more money, so we get you on some Coke. Now, okay, if you're addicted to those products, what are those drugs? What can we do in order to effectively help get you guys to kick the habit? Yeah, rehab. I mean, worst case scenario, we can go lock you guys in a cabin in a woods, thank you, Josh, where you don't have any of the drugs. If you have a heroin, opiate addiction, we can just force you to be someplace where you can't do heroin. Yeah, DT is going to be damn rough. Some folks might actually die from it if it's not well managed. But like anything else, you can get people off that. Now, let's say someone has a food addiction. How do we detox somebody from that? Yeah, we have to instead find a way to get them to make a deal with the devil for, you know, typically 3 meals a day. So that can be really, really difficult to do. So this is an important thing to keep in mind with not just talking to your athletes, but talking to the parents of those athletes and the coaches. It's bingo about how to have a good relationship with food, how to have a good relationship with your body, to not just get down on yourself because you don't look like XYZ person. And obviously, it's not just female athletes that run this risk. Male athletes can also get themselves in these situations. Wrestlers seem to have the highest risk for it when we're coming in for sporting endeavors, because like anything else, you put a lot of attention and energy into body size, and otherwise it can obviously run some risks. So just be nice and try to, once again, make it so people have a good relationship with their body, with the food they eat, and with how it makes them feel. So, any questions about how bones are going to function? Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with, if you find the dietary approach that works well for you, that's fine. You can go ahead and live with that methodology. The key is, once again, find the solution that works for you. So let's go ahead, and now we've talked about the way that our bones are going to change. So remember Wolff's Law, osteoblasts, osteoclasts, how we're going to go ahead and deal with compressive forces more than tensile, can then compare it to shearing, and kind of how it all, you know, comes together, the cortical, tubercular, etc. So let's talk about joints. So we have what's known as synarthroses. So these are relatively immovable joints. And so the sutures of our skull are effectively going to be these relatively immovable, where it shouldn't really shift too much. Obviously, some folks, you'll have more shifting, and especially with little kids, that's where these sutures haven't fully solidified yet, and we're getting even more movement in the sutures of the skull. Now, the syndesmoses, which happens to be the tibiofibular joint, where they're essentially held together with a really thick collagenous band near the ankle, that shouldn't move whatsoever. And then we have what's known as our amphithroses, and these are going to be slightly movable joints. So we can see right here, guys, this is going to be not just our synchondroses, which is the epithelial plates, but notice the symphysis between our vertebral joints. So let me tell you, those SI joints are going to move. Not a whole lot, but if any of you guys ever yourself or know someone that's sprained their SI joint, from experience, it hurts and it sucks because it's right at the base of the hip and it's real poopy when you're doing darn near anything. Now, we're then going to talk about the types of joints that you think of when you're really working with athletes, which is what's known, or when you're just moving your body around in general. These are what's known as diarthrodial joints or synovial joints. This is going to be where we've got articular cartilage. So we've got cartilage that's going to have this dense connective tissue covering the articulating bone surfaces. So it's not just going to be bone on bone. We then are going to have a capsule, okay? So we're going to have a membrane that goes around it that keeps essentially what we're going to see next of our synovial fluid inside of that joint, okay? And then finally, we have what's going to be bursa, which are going to be capsules filled with synovial fluid that cushion the different areas that they're trying to separate. So we can see that articular cartilage. We are then going to go ahead and see the capsule around it in general. We're talking about the knee joint. We're going to have some bursa, effectively, you can see right there with a suprapatellar bursa, giving us that synovial fluid on top, and then synovial fluid all through this area. So there are a lot of different types of synovial joints. We have got our gliding, which is going to be our facet joint. So we're talking about effectively through the backs, really through the posterior aspect of our vertebra. We then have hinge. So we're talking about the elbow. We are going to have pivot, which is going to be the radial ulnar joint. We're going to have the condyloid, which is going to be the radiocarpal. So now we're talking about our wrist. We've got our saddle joint, which is going to be our carpometacarpal of the thumb. And then we've got our ball and socket, which is going to go ahead and be our hip and our shoulder. A lot of different articulations we're going to see throughout the body. So the advantages of this articular cartilage is it allows the load to be spread over a wider area. Hence, it's going to be reducing that contact stress. So remember, pressure equals force divided by area. Also, it's going to give us that lubrication. So we're going to have lower friction, and it's going to make it a lot easier to move the joint without excessive wear. Now, fibrocartilage effectively is going to be different pads that we're going to have between joints. So our meniscus are a great example of articular fibrocartilage, which is going to, once again, increase that surface area between the two where they're interacting and keep the coefficient of friction low from the one side to the other. So this is going to be distributing that loads over the joint surfaces, making it so that we're going to have a tighter fit between the two, not allow a slip to occur between those articulating bones, protect the joint periphery, and lubricate the joint, along with working to absorb more of the shock going through the joint. Now, we then have what's known as articular connective tissues. So this is going to be, if it's connecting a muscle to a bone, it's a tendon. So this is going to be the calcaneus tendon, also known as the Achilles tendon on the back of your calf. We then are going to have ligaments, and this is going to be where we're connecting one bone to another. So this gives us some of that elastic recoil when we're talking about joints inside of our ankle and our foot. We've talked about our plantar fascia, which can be mostly made up of ligaments, not that we don't have a little bit of muscle in the bottom of the foot as well. Now, we can see all the different types of articular connective tissue that we're going to have in the knee, from obviously all of our different ligaments, and we can go from where we have our ACL and PCL, along with our MCL, LCL, that are all going to be effectively trying to keep the knee joint articulating together without even getting into all the different muscle that in theory is going to be keeping the knee effectively appropriately articulating. So joint stability is essentially how well is a joint able to resist abnormal displacement. So effectively, how good does that joint do of not being slipped out or moved in a position it's not supposed to? So any of you guys know somebody that has a major issue with dislocations? They've got, it's actually can be due to genetic variances in collagen production that some folks just naturally have hypermobility and otherwise throughout their body. Nice. Kristen, if you don't mind, go ahead and try not to give people acronyms. Go and give them the full name. And how do your friends typically present with that?
Sorry, it's much easier just to speak that. So it's Ehlers-Danlos, Ehlers, Ehlers-Danlos, and syndrome.
Mhm.
And it is like a congenital laxity in their joints because of their ligaments and connective tissue in general, and also can manifest in like cardiovascular symptoms, which is why I
Mhm.
know them. But many of them are like natural dancers and gymnasts, but they've like that was often their childhood interest, and many of them are now like runners and triathletes that I know. They have to be careful and make sure that they have like trained up their muscles in a way to like add protection
Mhm.
and strength so that they don't get out of alignment. But they're great. I mean, they beat me.
No, no, no. It's like anything else. It's obviously gave them a certain advantage when they were younger and doing things like dance and gymnastics because they naturally had that hypermobility. But exactly that hypermobility is something that can also put you into a more dangerous position. So easier to dislocate. And the problem, like anything else, guys, we all have a certain amount of adaptive reserve with any of our tissues. So if, so there you go, with obviously Austin and, the joys of the shoulder there. Once you go ahead and really have a bad dislocation, we can have a solid amount of tearing of a lot of those ligaments. Now you still have a lot of ligament intact, and will essentially that left over will hypertrophy and hopefully keep you more in the positions where you should. But like anything else, now you have a smaller amount of adaptive reserve because you don't have as many intact cells that can turn over. And so because of this, the problem, there's a number of problems. Your tendons and your ligaments only are going to repair at about 1/3 the speed that your muscles will. So that's why you can have a really bad um, muscle spasm. You strain a hamstring, a quad, a pec, blah blah blah, and you're able to train relatively normally in less than 1 or 2 weeks. But if you really strain a ligament, a tendon, that can take you months to recover, simply because once again that tissue recovers at such a slower rate. So with those individuals and with anybody, you just need to be obviously careful that you don't take it too far. Yeah, I yeah, I've had labral surgery for the shoulder, as well as had to have a pec reattached. Yeah, whenever you guys see me in person, if I'll show you the scar, it's whatever. It's the reason why I naturally have an asymmetric boob job. You can see how this one rolls up and this one doesn't. Yeah, it really doesn't hurt to tear a muscle, at least to tear the pec. It felt like a really thick magazine tearing, and then like a bungee cord snapping. It's a very unique sensation. Didn't really hurt. Just felt like kind of like, oh shit, but it was sore. At the end of the day, I had a real hard time taking my shirt off. And especially then just going about life the next day. But
Dr. Ling,
yeah.
um, I've definitely heard people talk about how after like Achilles injury that there's some idea of like eccentric loading helps realign the fibers that are growing back, or I'm definitely mixing up the science here, but it like lays down connective tissue in a pattern that it needs to be, rather than I'm assuming that means rather than at the oblique angles that you talked about in the last class that could lead to re-injury. um, is that like a general pattern that holds true, like that there's if we could eccentrically load tendons that we hurt, will they repair better? Badly worded question, but
No, no, no,
that's
it's
where I'm
okay.
going.
All right. So let's go ahead and draw this up. Okay. So let's say this is your tendon and this is the angle, and the angle of pull happens to be right above it of how you want it. And then you do something, I wouldn't, stupid's not fair, but you chop it in half. So then the doc tries to essentially get this to reattach. So let's say that's his staple. Well, then your body's going to lay down a crap ton of scar tissue. And that scar tissue is going to be not all perfectly lined up. Some of it's going to be coming in funnier angles. And my sister's the artist. Always remember that, guys. Okay. So now the problem is if we're pulling in that straight line, so think force vectoring, perfect. That is the angle we need to be in. But if we have other pieces of scar tissue that are pulling like this, now this is getting a shearing stress every single time it pulls. And then same thing, you know, for the other scar tissue that's going the other direction, that's all getting a shearing force going through it. And that remodeling is obviously not as good as the original structure before we ever tore it. And in fact, it now has a lot of these defects. So this will eventually cause the scar tissue itself to break and then hopefully eventually remodel closer to being in that straight line of pull that it should be. And so that's why it's really important after you go through a surgery to reattach a muscle, you know, or reattach a tendon, that you are going to go and make sure you are applying enough force to get this tendon to remodel along its angle of pull. Because yes, this scar tissue, just like after a bad muscle strain, can lay down in such a way that it puts your fibers essentially, instead of being in a nice linear arrangement for that force production, it's now pulling at oblique angles, which naturally is going to create that possible shearing, which can re-injure it. And that's why when you meet somebody who's, you know, had a real bad hamstring strain or otherwise, they can have an issue with restraining it or re-injuring it quite frequently because those tissues aren't pulling in those straight lines that they're supposed to. Now, you have another major issue with your tendons and ligaments compared to your muscle, which is blood supply. Your tendons and your ligaments, after you're no longer a child or a really, really freaking jacked up and damaged tendon and ligament, have no blood supply. So the only way they get nutrient turnover is by moving them. So if you're not moving them, they're not getting any blood supply. If they're not getting any blood supply, how well do you think they're recovering? Exactly. And so that's one of the most brutal thing about injuring any, in fact, no offense, Gabby, what are you currently wearing on your leg these days? Yes, a large brace. And, you know, that's because obviously you had to have surgery and they're, you know, fixing the knee and it's going to keep getting better and you're going to keep improving. But that's why you also need to go and do your rehab quite frequently, because it's telling those tendons and ligaments like, this is our angle of pull. We need to be ready for this angle of pull. It's going to keep coming at us. And so we need to remodel along those lines. And when you're moving those tendons and ligaments, now through effectively that pumping action, through that diffusion, you're going to get nutrient turnover, which in turn is going to allow you to recover. And then obviously train more frequent, and then eventually get those connective tissues to work like they're supposed to. Yeah. Getting hurt sucks. So you want to do your best to make sure that you're going to go ahead and recover as quickly as you can. So things that are going to make our joints more stable, well, it turns out the better of a reciprocating match we have between the two different surfaces, the greater the stability. The more ligaments and muscles we have crossing the joint, and notice the absence of fatigue. So when it comes to people, you know, when you think about much higher rates of tearing ACLs and female soccer players and basketball players, part of it isn't necessarily due to strong muscles and tendons. It can be literally due to fatigue. They get tired, their movements become essentially less fluid, less stable, and that is when injuries happen. So if I remember correctly, statistically speaking, catastrophic injuries in a lot of sports are more likely to happen in the later half of the games than that happens to happen in the first half of the game. So when we think about reciprocally shaped parts, you know, the ball and the socket, and the saddle joints on either side, and then the hinge. So for example, your IT band, which is connecting from obviously the high glute and the TFL all the way into the patella, is going to help keep that patella articulating appropriately, while it's also making sure that we're getting the tibia to stay in that location where it needs to be. Now, when we think about joint flexibility, this is going to be the range of motion that we're going to effectively allow someone to move through when we happen to be essentially giving them a little bit of force or help. So if we're thinking about reaching up as far as we can overhead, how far can we get that arm behind us? How much flexibility we have in the shoulder and in the tricep and lat. And you can tell that I do not have great flexibility there. Something I need to work on. Okay. So what's going to be influence or flexibility? Well, it turns out the bone, muscle, tissue, fat, anything in the way of the end of the range of motion. So for example, if I'm going to go ahead and just, stand up and then I'm going to go bend over and touch my toes. Okay. That's not a problem. I can do that all day long. Now, if I go and do the same thing and I have my kneeling pad and I try to bend over, that's as far as I can go because now I'm hung up on the pad, which is fine. But that would be the equivalent of having either, I don't know, really, really massive abs or having a much bigger belly that in turn is going to intervene with my ability to lean over. Now, obviously, how tight or lax the muscles and the tissues around the joints are going to be. So how tight are my hamstrings? How tight are my glutes? That's going to influence, and all the muscles of my spinal erectors allowing me to go over. Now, muscle fatigue, usually you can go ahead and move a little bit further if you're a bit more fatigued than if you're really fresh, and especially you're cold. And then how much previous scar tissue do we have? And then the good old massive modifiers of everything we're doing, genetics and age. So obviously some of Kristen's friends would easily be able to touch their toes with relative ease, thanks to those genetic advantages for greater mobility, which obviously can work against you as a double-edged sword if you're not careful. And then with age, mobility or flexibility tends to decline simply because people aren't moving as much. And plus, you've lived a longer life, so you're now much more likely to have a lot more scar tissue. So now, when it comes to increasing joint flexibility, we have what's known as Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles. And muscle spindles detect stretch upon the muscle, and when they detect stretch upon the muscle, they tell the muscle to contract so we don't tear the muscle. Now, Golgi tendon organ is going to detect stretch upon the tendon. And whenever the tendon is stretching too far, it's going to tell the muscle to relax so we do not risk tearing the tendon itself. So we can use things like PNF stretching and otherwise, which I would suggest all of you guys Google on your own. So literally just Google PNF stretching, and you will see examples of things you can do in order to go ahead and get folks to move through a slightly larger range of motion than they would have been able to move through otherwise. Now, the GTOs tend to become less sensitive with training, and the muscle spindles tend to become more sensitive with training, which is part of the reason why it becomes easier, not very easy, but a little bit easier to tear your tendons when you get to be very strong or very powerful, because these are not going to be shutting down your muscles and keeping you from effectively hurting yourself like they would have otherwise. So here is another happy way of looking at how all of this is going to go ahead and work. And then we have what's known as stretch reflexes. So this is why the doc would hit you on the patellar tendon with a rubber mallet, because literally it's looking at how quickly does your muscle spindle detect the stretch, send the information through your spinal cord, and then back out to cause your muscle to twitch as a means to obviously protect the muscle. So the longer delay there, the less efficient and effective that real quick nervous reflex is, which can be obviously a telltale sign of some other neurological deficiencies. So active stretching is going to be where we're trying to go ahead and pull ourselves into the stretch. Passive is where we're just going to use the force, typically of our body, to get us further into that stretch. Okay, both of which have their own advantages. Ballistic is going to be real quick bouncing, so really just kind of throwing yourself into the position and coming back out of it. And obviously static is just going to be holding a position, usually for about 30 seconds, potentially longer. 30 seconds to 2 minutes really seems to be where you're getting a decent amount of actual changes in tissue length if we're going to go static. PNF, where we're going to purposefully have someone push against in order to go ahead and get a bit of a stretching effect. And then from there, go ahead and have them relax a little bit. We'll come back. I I think we've got a little bit of time today, so we'll make it weird. We'll see if I can get somebody in here and we'll do a little PNF stretching to kind of see how that works a little bit. So you guys can have an example. Plus, it'll just be funny to make my morning a little bit weirder for my GA. Now, unfortunately, arthritis is something obviously that can happen. This is typically due to degeneration of our cartilage. Now, this is going to be linked with pain, swelling, changes in range of motion, and stiffness. Now, the cause is unknown as in a perfect world, but like anything else, remember, all our tissues have a certain amount of adaptive capacity. If we keep beating them down and not allowing them to completely recover, well, then it turns out at some point we're going to have to effectively, we're not going to be able to recover from as much. And at a certain point, now that we've exhausted those capabilities, we're not able to build as much cartilage back from all the damage we're doing. Congratulations, you're looking at bone on bone. You're only going to do that for so long before, congratulations, you're going to be in a lot of pain. Now, the funny thing is it also seems to happen from too little movement, which is a strange thing to think about, but at the same time, it makes sense in that if you're not giving your body enough reason to essentially make sure that we're getting that turnover because we don't have that vasculature going to those areas, we're not going to get the recovery in those tissues and they're not going to function like they should. So that is the weird catch-22 of the human body, is you need to stay moving. If you stop moving, that's where we're going to have ourselves some issues. So there's a number of different common joint injuries. You can obviously sprain, which I'm sure all of you guys have done. It's usually ligament damage, dislocate, where we're getting things out. Bursitis, where we're talking about obviously an acute like injury to the area that's going to make it uncomfortable. Arthritis and, well, rheumatoid is going to be more of a body natural autoimmune response to your connective tissues. And then osteoarthritis, which is going to be a decreased functioning also of the bone as we get to be older. Now, we're going to go ahead and have you guys work in groups for the next, say, 10 minutes. And you guys, depending on the group you're in, have a semi-simple question I want you guys to go and answer. So group one, how fast does bone really remodel? So if we're really talking about increasing bone mineral density and otherwise, how fast does that really happen? Okay. Group two, how fast do our tendons remodel? So how quickly do we repair tendons? What's that turnover like from the initial signal to now we're getting changes in the body? And then finally, group three, the basics of how fast ligaments remodel. Use the power of the Googles, the Wikipedia, everything else you have at your fingertips. Please try to make sure what you're looking at is peer reviewed, but get an idea for, okay, how fast do things really happen? So whenever you guys are ready, I've got those breakout rooms open and I'll see if I can coerce Yehor to come in here at some point so we can go ahead and talk about the joys of PNF stretching. So get in those groups, get after it, have some fun. When you're ready, go ahead and paste in what you guys came up with for those timelines. And we'll go and go through it along with, I'm going to go ahead and get Yehor to swing on over here. He's going to take a seat in the mediocre chair and we're going to talk about PNF. Oh, dude, you're doing great work. Okay, so everyone, this is Yehor. Yehor, this is everyone. Okay, so he's going to go ahead, interlock his fingers behind his head. So if I come back here, he's going to get a bit of stretch on his pecs. Sound about right? Yes?
Yeah.
Right there?
Yeah.
Okay, so now I'm going to come forward a little bit. Now he's going to try to touch his elbows together in front of his body. Whenever you're ready, start pushing. Push, push. Come on, Yehor. Come on, come on. And relax. And see how now we can go a little bit further than we went before. And so what we're doing is when he's contracting those muscles maximally, we're effectively getting those, thanks bud, perfect. We're going and we're getting that Golgi tendon organ to really fire, and then we're inhibiting his muscle spindles. So that's what we talk about PNF, where you can go ahead and do a contract, relax, and you're going to be able to go a little bit further. Nice, Anouk. Yeah. Yeah. And isn't it wild when you look at those timelines, guys, for tendons, ligaments, and bone repair, where we're really looking at easily over a month. So when you're working with athletes, when they're coming back from major injuries, well, that's the first reason why we do prehabilitation, so we don't injure the person in the first place. So we're going to be able to get them to stay training, stay healthy, and stay performing. So on the nutritional side, when we're looking at trying to repair those tendons and ligaments faster, that's where you see people using collagen supplementation. Now, mind you, collagen, you got to talk about 20 grams of it. Not like you can just eat one thing of Jell-O, which is only like 1 gram of protein, but a lot of carbs, sugar specifically. So, but proline, hydroxyproline, glycine, hydroxyglycine are all very important when it comes to effectively that turnover and building the collagen. So those are the major building blocks that are necessary there. Now, when it comes to our full remodeling of our skeleton, we're talking about literally, it actually occurs once a decade. So every single part of every single bone in your body will have actually been swapped out in that period of time. That's just because all of our cells are constantly turning over, but it's not going to be a rapid change. So hence the 6 weeks to a full year to get remodeling in some body parts. But we can speed it up. Notice that 6-week timeline if we happen to be moving the tissue appropriately. So we're getting that nutrient delivery and waste product removal. Whereas if we're not really moving, we're not getting it to do much work, that's where we're talking about that full year. So any questions, comments, concerns about anything we covered today? Well, then guys, nice work today. Stay safe out there, guys, and I will see you guys on Thursday morning, where we're just going to keep on charging forward, and we're going to talk about skeletal muscle. And then from there, we only got 1 chapter left. Then it's reviews, presentations, and your final exam. So stay safe out there, guys. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you guys then. Make sure you're staying on top of your homeworks, your assignments, and those wonderful labs. The videos are up that you can use, or worst case scenario, come on over here and we'll just do the testing in person. So stay safe out there, guys, and bye-bye.